The name of the veteran is J. Harry Adams. His birth date is 27 June 1925. He served in World War II in the Army Air Corps. Highest rank achieved was Tech Sergeant. We're in Bethany Beach, Delaware. My name is Thomas Drake, and this interview is being conducted for the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress. So, Mr. Adams, just to get started, a few biographical details. Just to say where and when you were born, what your parents were doing, number of siblings.
Born in Lexington, Kentucky, as an only child. My father worked at the U.S. Public Health Service hospital, which was really a federal prison, the first of its kind in the country for drug addicts and also physicians who sold drugs. And later on there was another one of these facilities that was built in Fort Worth, Texas. But he was, and my mother was a cafeteria manager at a local school. And in 1943, my father was transferred, 42, transferred to Bethesda, Maryland, as the National Institutes of Health were being constructed. And at that time, I stayed in Kentucky until the last half of my senior year in high school, and then I moved to Bethesda, Maryland in February of 1943 and finished high school at Bethesda Chevy Chase High.
What were you doing right before you entered the service?
I was a musician. I started playing trumpet in small dance groups in Lexington when I was 15 years old. Mm-hmm. And when I moved to Washington, D.C., I joined the union and played just, I guess, practically as a substitute, practically in every hotel or night spot in the area that needed a trumpet player for a certain time, and they would call, and the union would call and see if I was available, mm-hmm. and I would do it. So when I went into the service, I told them I was a musician. One little aside, before I went in, I took the exam for the Naval School of Music, and I passed it. There were 6 of us, and 4 of us passed it that day. And it was probably the best school of music in the country at the time. Mm-hmm. So I was told then that if I wanted to wait to be drafted, that was fine, but I would come over to the Naval School and enlist for 6 years, because anyone who ever went to the Naval School of Music enlisted, re-enlisted, or enlisted for 6 years. And I said to myself, I really didn't think I wanted to try to do that, so I let that go by. And I went on in to finish high school in June of '43, and in August I was in basic training.
Now, before we get into your early days of service and when you actually joined, are there any other family members who served in the military?
No.
Okay. So how did you actually enter service? You're in the D.C. area. How did you actually enter service?
I was drafted at the Bethesda, Maryland draft center.
Okay. And the reason you were drafted into the Army Air Corps? Or what were you drafted into? Or did you have a choice?
I was just drafted into service.
Okay.
I really didn't know where I was going. Yeah. I kept telling the people in classification that I was a musician and I would like to be in an Army band, but they didn't need them at that time. They needed other people.
Okay. So they ended up choosing you for?
The Air Corps cadet system, okay. Yes.
And so where did they send you?
Greensboro, North Carolina, for an abbreviated basic training, and then to Springfield College, Springfield, Massachusetts, for 6 months. But after about 5.5 months, and this was like one of the academies, really. It was that type of training. We had college courses, which later on, as a matter of fact, George Washington University accepted my credits from up there. And then, of course, we had the military courses. And I had 9 hours and 45 minutes of dual instruction in a Piper Cub. Mm. And then they asked us one day, were we drafted or did you enlist? And since I was drafted, I was put into, sent to radio school in Scottsville, Illinois. Some of them went to engineer school, others went to armament school.
Mm-hmm. What was it like adapting to military life?
It was
physical regimen, the barracks life, food.
We had a couple of funny incidents. Like the first day, I left from Silver Spring, Maryland, went to Fort Lee, Virginia, and we got there, pouring down rain. They gave us raincoats and gave us baked beans and hot dogs and baked beans, and said that we were going to take our classification exams. This was night by this time, and I thought, well, I'll be probably a raving idiot. I'm tired. First time I've ever been away from home, except at Boy Scout camp once. And 18-year-old kid,
right.
All brand new. Anyway, we did take the exams, and I guess I must have done fairly well since I was selected to be in the Air Corps Cadets. But the first night, tired after all the exams, went to bed. I heard a whistle, and I'm in a barracks with 49 other people. Never saw one of them before in my life. Pulled a blanket over my head. The next thing I knew, I was on the floor. The bed was on top of me, and a PFC or a corporal was blowing a whistle in my ear. That was my introduction to military life. And I guarantee you, I did not pull the blanket over my head again.
I saw the equivalent of that happen to me when I was in the Air Force during boot camp. Anything else you want to say about like the food during training, basic, your boot camp training?
Food was, it was all right. I didn't have any problem with the food.
Okay.
I had, of course, growing up in Kentucky, we used to say if it wasn't fried, we didn't eat it. But I'm quite sure that the military tried to give us all the advantages of food they possibly could, and I had no problem with the food. One occasion I did, but that was later on.
Okay. Anything else you want to say about the training you had in the United States before you went overseas?
Well, of course, that's where all mine was. I went from Springfield College to Scottsfield, Illinois for radio school.
Okay.
And when I would get to a base, I carried my trumpet with me, and I'd try to get in a band. Scottsfield, I managed to get in probably the best dance band I ever played in my life.
Wow.
We had double-decker barracks at Scottsfield since it was a permanent base. And because at Greensboro, North Carolina, we were in what we call tar paper sacks. But Scottsfield, we had a band, a dance band. The first floor we rehearsed, second floor where we slept, and we would march the cadets the students to radio school, and then we would go to radio school, just walk. But we had about a 17-piece dance band.
Wow.
And we played at all the USO dances, the officer club, the NCO clubs. It was really great. And we had 5 months of radio. We were actually radio operator mechanics. Now I must say that later on, when anything would happen to a radio on board, I would talk to the mechanics on the base instead of trying to do it myself, because we had more operator training than mechanic. And then after radio school, I went to Yuma, Arizona gunnery school. That was it wasn't a bad experience. I guess we were in tents out on the Yuma Desert, and we were firing air-cooled 50 calibers in 117 degrees days.
Wow.
That was wee taxing. And at night it got so cold we had covered up everything we possibly had. And when we came to Yuma, we were on a troop train from Scottsfield to Yuma, Arizona, 5 days.
Wow.
And we'd run out of water and the usual things on a troop train. However, I had my horn, and a couple more guys had instruments, so we played,
wow,
going out all the time. And Yuma was, talking about the food now,
okay,
one day they gave us, I guess it was pork chops, but they should have known better in that heat. And about, I don't know, 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, I woke up, boy, I had to run out of my tent, and I found myself in lines, wow, waiting to get into the latrines.
Wow.
So the next day we lined up and they had a table full of little shot glasses full. I thought it was liquid concrete. There was little shot glasses full of some white liquid, and we did that and everything became all right in a couple of days.
Wow.
Other than that, Yuma we never went to town at Yuma. It's the only base that I was there 3 months, picked off a train, taken by truck to the base, put on a truck, taken back to a train 3 months later. Never off the base. And then I had a delay in route at that time from Yuma to Lincoln, Nebraska. Had 10 days in which to get there. And so I came home to Bethesda, Maryland for a couple of days. And I believe that was a very fortunate incident because I believe that that's where I met my wife. Even though we graduated from high school together in the same class, but because I only went there the last half of my senior year, I was a musician, playing on weekends, I didn't know her.
Wow.
And she worked at Public Health Service like my father did, and he said one morning, I wanted the car for some reason. And I just got up and threw a jacket on and drove. I was going to drive him to work, and he said, pick that young lady up. She's waiting for a bus, and she works out there. And I did, and that was her.
Wow.
So anyway, then I went on to Lincoln, Nebraska, and that's where we called it crewed up, would put on an air crew. And I was assigned to Emil Vukovic's air crew as the radio operator. And it was a good bunch of guys. A couple of them were older. It was a little funny. I, of course, was still, I guess I might have turned 19 by that time.
Mm-hmm.
Tail gunner was a little bit younger than me, but the others were older. We had a waist gunner and a ball turret gunner and an engineer who were in their 30s.
Mm.
And of course that was a little old in those days to be on an air crew. Most of us were, very young. But anyway, and the officers were very good. We enjoyed them, and once we got assigned to an air crew, well, that changed your life. Your pilot, of course, was your commanding officer, and you lived with these other 8 gentlemen. And that was it. It was nice after that. And then we were moved to Rapid City, South Dakota for our last training before we went overseas. We were to be there 3 months, and one thing I could not understand until we got there, here it was, we were supposed to fly just about every day. We arrived at Rapid City, South Dakota the day before Thanksgiving. Snow, I could not believe it. I said, how in the world are we going to get these things off the ground? We only missed 1 day of flying because of cold.
Wow.
And 117 went down the runway and the engine stopped about halfway down, and we couldn't even pull the props through. And we always had to do that in those days. We would get there and pull to get the oil moving in the engines. And so that one day we couldn't, but the other days we flew.
Wow.
So it turned out very well, and Rapid City was a nice base.
Mm-hmm.
And especially in the morning when you flew. We flew either morning, noon, or night. And in the mornings when you fly about 5 o'clock, we would walk behind the chow lines, as we called them. They had quart bottles of fresh milk, and they said, how do you want your eggs?
Wow.
We told them that way. Now, we didn't get that service if we flew in the afternoon or night, but in the mornings we did. So we spent 3 months there, and then went to Topeka, Kansas, and got on a brand new B-17. It's the only one I was ever on where the heaters worked.
Wow.
But we had no armor on it, no guns, no anything, just new. Everything worked perfectly. And we flew from there to Grenier Field, New Hampshire, refueled, Goose Bay, Labrador. We were to be in Goose Bay overnight. We were there 7 days because it snowed and iced and they couldn't clear the runways for us. So they finally put us on beer rations.
Wow.
We were there so long. So in short, it took us 11 days to get from Topeka, Kansas to Prestwick, Scotland. But because of the delays like that. flew from Green Bay, Goose Bay, Labrador to Iceland, and we were there a couple of days, and then on to Prestwick, Scotland, and then by train down to Molesworth, England, where we were there for the rest of the time we spent, which was late in the war. I was there, I think, arrived there 16 April 1945. Yeah. And then spent the rest of the time there. Our most interesting experiences were after the war, and we would fly minimum crew. A minimum crew was 5. Your pilot, co-pilot, navigator, engineer, radio operator had to be on the plane when it left the ground. So we called that a minimum crew. And we were assigned to pick up French people who had been German prisoners of war, and they were all had been gathered at Linz, Austria, and the army got them together and as they got through the concentration camps. And they had them down there in freight cars full of straw, and that's where they were living until we could get them out. And it was quite a run, of course, for a B-17 in those days from Molesworth, England to Linz, Austria. But we had floors, plywood floors in the bomb bays, and they also, which the French people didn't know, they were hooked up to bomb racks, just in case. Wow. But I was the only one in the back of the airplane, and we would pull up, and the Army gentlemen had 30 of them, 30 French people, wow, who the only thing they knew that they owned in their life was what they had right then. They didn't know whether their home was there. They didn't know anything about it. They had been German prisoners for years. So we'd pick up 30 of them, and I would get as many of them in the bomb bays as we could for takeoff. And then we didn't even cut the engines. And we got them all on board. And a little interesting aside there, when the first time I went on that, Army man came up, he had a 45 and a rifle. Of course, we carried 45s calibers too, but had a rifle, and I said to him out of the door of the plane, "Do you have a German Luger?" He said, "Oh yes." I said, "What do you want for it? I'd like to have one." He said, "How about your watch?" I said, "They signed that to me. I've got to turn that back in." "Well, how about your sunglasses?" Well, they did that to me too, because radio operator, we did have sunglasses and watches, and also binoculars. Money was nothing. Every one of us had money. He said, "I've got a lot of money, you've got a lot of money. I don't want money." Everything was on the barter system. So I ended up not getting a Luger. So we brought 30 of them back into Charleville, France, which was a small town up near the German border. And again, I just got them off the plane, didn't stop the engines, and then back to Molesworth, where they put enough DDT on us to last us a lifetime. I'm surprised any of us are still alive, really. Wow. And then to bed, and the next morning off again. And we did that. I really lost track. I don't know how many times that we brought people back. But it was a good experience, thinking, you know, you were really helping people who had nothing to come home to. Then after we came back we were assigned to Sudbury, England, for about 2 or 3 days because we closed the base at Molesworth. It was an English base. And we flew from Sudbury to Wales and landed at Wales, where we were supposed to be there overnight. And one thing I do remember there, the British would not let us in their mess halls. Why, I don't know, of course. But we did have K rations on board, so we had, because we brought a bunch of stuff back from the base since we closed it down. And we were supposed to be there just overnight or a couple of days. We started the engines, got out, and somebody put a bucket over that B-17. The fog rolled in. You couldn't even see the end of the wings. Wow. So we were there, ended up being there 3 or 4 days because of the fog. Came back from Wales, landed at Iceland, then landed at Bradley Field, Connecticut. The next morning went to Miles Standish, Massachusetts, where we left for our 30 days leave that you get when you come back from overseas. And we were supposed to train, I was supposed to go back to, I think it was called Tampa Air Force Base at the time. I think it became MacDill Field.
Mm-hmm.
And we were going to train in B-29s because the war was still on in Japan.
Right.
And we were going to train our crew in B-29s and go to the Pacific. But when we got to the night before I was to leave for Tampa, I was watching a movie at Fort Meade, Maryland, which I had to report back to, and they stopped the movie and said VJ Day. Well, of course, I still had to go to Tampa. So the next day I went to Tampa, and we never trained at B-29s, and I still had a few months left to do because we had the system then that you had to be in for so many months. And so they said, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I came in as a musician, you wouldn't let me be one. So I became a trumpet player. In fact, my MOS when I was discharged was trumpet player, musician, trumpet. And I was assigned to a small, it was more or less again a dance band in Alexandria, Louisiana.
Wow.
Fortunately, I was not in Alexandria too long because that wasn't one of the nicest places I'd ever been to. I went to Shreveport and then to McGuire General Hospital in Richmond, Virginia, where we played for, it was an amputee and hospital, and we played in the wards and all the dances and everything there. And I was discharged in February 26, 1946 from McGuire General Hospital through Fort Meade, Maryland.
Wow. What was it like flying?
It was really great. When I was in classification, a Air Force lieutenant or Air Corps lieutenant, I hardly knew the difference. The officer was an officer, but he said, you want to fly? And it was not a question, really, it was a statement. And I said, no, I do not care to fly, I play trumpet. And he said, but you'll like to fly. And I remember saying, no, I won't like to fly. And he said, but I think you'll really like it. And he gave me back my folder. He wrote something on it and gave it back to me. I went to the next gentleman, and he looked up at me, and I said, I'm a trumpet player. And he looked at the folder, and he said, no, you are a volunteer flight trainee. And the other officer had written VFT on the folder. So I became a volunteer flight trainee, and that's when I was assigned to the cadet system. Wow. But once I got on an air crew, air crew living was good. It was different. And it was a good life.
You want to say anything about that camaraderie?
Oh, absolutely. We had wonderful people on our crew. We had a little thing with our pilot. He just never quite learned to land the B-17 for some reason. But our co-pilot, who I understand had been a first pilot on a B-24 and requested a transfer to medium bombers, B-25, B-26. And instead they made him a co-pilot on a B-17. But it didn't bother him. He was not upset about it. And he was a wonderful guy, crew member. But we started yelling over the intercom system. That's another thing you could do on an air crew. You had lieutenants, and of course we were EMs. However, you became sort of one. We called each other by first names and things of that type. And we probably should have, but in town, of course, we'd salute our officers, but otherwise we were friends. And we started calling over the intercom, and Vukovic, our pilot, started letting our co-pilot land the plane. That's another little funny incident. When we came back from England, landed at Bradley Field, Connecticut. Now, we were a group, I don't know how many B-17s there were. It might have been 100. There were a lot of us. And we landed so hard that we blew both front tires.
Wow.
Now, a B-17 in those days landed at 90 miles an hour. That seems strange talking about what these jets do, but 90 miles an hour. And we went down the runway for a little while at 90 miles an hour on the hubs. And then we turned sideways, and these other B-17s are up there waiting for us to get off the runway, and I'll never forget it. A major came out in a Jeep, and he did talk to our pilot. Not in very glowing terms, but he did talk to him. And they came out and had to tow our plane off the strip.
Wow.
But crew living was good. We had a good air crew, and we still, there's only 4 of us left now. 4. The tail gunner lives in California. Our engineer is in a assisted living home in Lincoln, Nebraska. Omaha. Our navigator now lives in Georgia, and I am here. The rest of them have passed on.
How often do you stay in touch with them? Do you stay in touch with, or is it pure?
I have a letter right here that I've got to answer from our navigator. Really, the navigator is the only one, other than Christmas. We do send Christmas notes. The navigator and I, though, as a matter of fact, when we were traveling, able to travel more, he lived in Orlando, Florida. And when we'd go to Florida, we'd always get together with him. And so we saw each other frequently then. He's a wonderful gentleman. Of our officers, we, the enlisted men, thought more of him. And he's the one that stayed in the service.
How did you stay in touch with family and friends back home when you were overseas?
Just email, what do they call them? Those mails we had, weren't emails.
The V system, did you have?
Yeah, V-mail,
yeah.
V-mails. Yeah, and then correspondence. Of course, we had to be very careful what we wrote. I remember our tail gunner, the first day we were there, we were assigned to a 20-man Quonset hut, and another crew came in off of a mission, and they were talking about it, and for some reason our tail gunner put in a letter some of the things that they were talking about, and of course the base censor caught it, and this gentleman was, our tail gunner was taken off our crew for a little while.
Wow.
Because of that. But just correspondence, and then I must admit I probably didn't write near enough as I should have, but other than that, that was it.
What about people, friends and family communicating with you? Did you get mail from home?
Oh yes, well, I had mail from my mother especially. Oh yes, yeah, you know the mothers,
so what was
especially being an only child.
Yeah, so what was mail call like?
Well, I just do not recall many things like that. It's so long ago that the small things like that are just erased. I don't have them.
What about England itself during that time period? What was it like living in England? Did you get a chance when you weren't flying or training or doing other duties as assigned? Did you were able to get off base?
I got in London one weekend, and I decided then, a couple of us on the crew, that probably the only way we're really going to see this place, and we got on a tour bus and went through London on a tour bus. But we had to go back early the next day, so it really wasn't the whole weekend that we spent there. That was the only time I was ever in London. We had a little pub in Molesworth, in the little town, and we'd get in there occasionally. But we just did a lot of, we had not too much training. Occasionally us radio operators would have some training, but not very much even, because we had been trained, I guess, as much as we could be. And just ourselves on the base, that was it. We had a movie theater, it was a nice base, and that was it. We didn't have too much social life. We had a lady that did some of our laundry, and she did it for soap powder.
Wow.
No money, again, no money. Soap powder. She couldn't get it, we had it.
Right, wow. So you had mentioned where you were when the war ended, and then you went back to the States, and you were going to be trained in B-29s, but of course then there was VJ Day. How were you received when you finally got out in February? When you came back home, how were you received by family, friends, or in your community?
Oh, great! I had no problem with that. Matter of fact, started playing again in Washington, and I had two uncles, technically half uncles,
Okay.
who were in service. Oh, pardon me, three. The oldest half brother of my father's was military. He was discharged. He got his retirement as a, I think he was a light colonel. And the middle brother was a master sergeant, and also the younger brother was a master sergeant in the Army. So all four of us were in. Now, my father never served. His age got him. He was right between everything. And so, no, I had no problem at all with that. I must say, never did too much with it. I didn't join, for example, the American Legion until after we were married. We've been married 62 years, by the way, and we were married in '49. And I joined the American Legion then, and I was very active in that. And we did have a VFW, but it was not much in Rockville. Well, I never joined until I got here. Now I'm a life member of the one here. And of course, the American Legion of Ocean City, Maryland, which I don't go down. I joined that many years ago for a reason, and so I'm what we used to call a card carrier in those. So, but no, I had no problem at all. But I did not broadcast it. I'm quite sure, even when I played in bands, none of them probably ever knew had been in service.
Wow.
And even when I worked for what was called the Army Map Service then, they didn't. And I worked with a gentleman who was a surveyor, one of the best I've ever known. I never knew that he was a navigator on a B-17 until after I read his obituary.
Wow.
We just didn't talk about it, even though they had a reserve unit at the Army Map Service. And they tried to get me into it because, of course, from records they knew I was at least a tech sergeant. And but I just probably should have joined it, and I never did. But it just wasn't talked about like that.
What would you say when someone asks, why did you talk about it?
Why I did or why I didn't?
Why didn't you? Yeah. Why don't you think war experiences were sometimes often not discussed?
I really don't know. I just never came up.
Never came up.
No, it didn't. It's funny because the majority of us had been in service, one thing or another. Although I must say some, and I'm thinking back now, not at the time, a lot of people I worked with out there were not in service. There was one gentleman that we used to talk about it because he lost a leg. He was in Tank Corps. And he lost a leg in North Africa. And he and I used to talk a little bit about it because we became pretty good friends, worked in the same area together. But and I said, this other gentleman was a navigator. I never knew it until I read his obit. So it was just one of those things. We had nothing, nobody ever said anything bad about us, or it just didn't happen. I do more of it now than I did then. I wear my cap now. I have an 8th Air Force emblem on the front, WW2, 303rd. I get more comments, and it's a good conversation piece.
Yeah.
Except the other night I went to a little farewell party for our local priest here in Bethany Beach, and I walked in the door with her with a wheelchair, and I did have my cap on. First thing, there was a gentleman standing there said, "Oh, 8th Air Force, my father was in the 8th Air Force." At least he didn't say his grandfather, he said his father.
Right. How do you think your experiences in the Army Air Corps and stationed overseas in England affected your life?
As I said earlier, I think to the better. I learned independence, which I didn't have to do before I went in, and I think it really made a better person out of me. I learned discipline, and you learn that very early, and you better learn it, which is perfectly due to me. It's like I said, our grandson, one of our grandsons is in service now, and one of the first things, since I was the only person in our whole family that had ever been in before, he and I talked a lot about it before he went in, and I said, Brian, you just remember one thing. You never get in trouble with the military because they're going to win, and they should. So just do what you think is right, but be careful and don't get in trouble with it. And I think the discipline is, military discipline's great. I think the military is good. I had no problem with it. Matter of fact, I often think if they had, I was offered a master sergeant when I got out where I was located. And I often thought, in fact, I said to one guy, one of the gentlemen down there, that if they had had flying masters, because at that particular point, and I was air crew, if they'd had flying masters, I don't know, I might have been a little tempted or something, but I wanted it to
life lessons you learned from your military service that you'd like to share for the record?
Well, I think the best thing was your discipline and your orderly way of life. There are a lot of things that go on today that we didn't do. We didn't even think about doing, and I think part of our not thinking about things like that was our military training and the discipline that it afforded. And even though we did, you say we did not have much independence because they told us when to eat and when to do this and when to do that. However, it was good. It was nothing mean about it or anything like that. It was just good for the service, and therefore I think it was good for the individual. I've said many a time, I think the service was good for me.
Anything you would like to say to the younger generation as you look back on your experiences as a veteran and then come forward, 65 plus years?
One thing I've always been for, which has never happened, is universal military training. I firmly believe that if these people come out of high school, if they went in the service for a year, I don't know, 15 months, something like that, and get some of that training. I don't mean the harsh physical training that we had early, because we were all totally out of shape and everything like that, but the military training, I think it would make a much better person out of all of them. I've always been a great believer in universal military training. Even to this day I am. Even though sometimes when I talk like that, people wonder why I was never in, that just didn't stay in service. Well, it was a little bit different coming out at the time. You have second thoughts sometimes, but I still believe it is a good training platform. Wonderful.
Any reflections on where our country is today when you look back on where we were then?
Well, our friend Mike Melvin, who recommended you to see me, talk about this all the time. And one of the things we constantly say is that we wish today we had leaders like Patton, Eisenhower, MacArthur, Bradley, individuals like that. If he and I just believe, maybe right, maybe wrong, but if we had leaders like that, we wouldn't be in the shape we're in these wars that we're in. We have our leaders now who we believe, right or wrong, it's our feeling, that are thinking more about themselves and their retirement than they are about getting this job done. The leaders back then, they were real leaders. They were right up front with them, and they were great people.
So what do you think, if you had to give a few characteristics of a real leader, what would they be and why? What is it about a real leader? What do they,
well, again,
demonstrate?
It's an individual who demands respect, but he earns it. And I think there are a lot of people now, or some of our leaders in the, if you want to call it in the military, who are where they are, but they do not necessarily have the respect of the people under them. And you have to earn that respect. And I think that people, which I mentioned, like Patton got himself in some trouble sometimes, but I don't think there was a man that ever served under him didn't respect him. You have to have that respect, and you earn it by being up there with the people. And you give in to them sometimes. Life is a compromise. It's not always one thing or the other. Sometimes you have a gray area, but it's still a compromise. And I learned that also in my 33.5 years of working, because I was in a military organization then as a civilian. And it is that you compromise, and that's life. And you have to do that. And you have to do everything as you see fit at the time. I used to tell my assistant sometimes, he would get upset if we lost a little battle or something. I'd say, Harold, we ran it up the flagpole to see who saluted it. We found out who saluted it. Now, you must admit, we won 99% of them. We might lose one. Oh, you forget it, go on and do your best. But as long as they respect you, then I think you become a leader.
Any final thoughts as you reflect back on your service to our nation, and particularly in light of the fact that today is Veterans Day and it's 11/11/2011?
Oh yes, matter of fact, I've had several people say something to me today that they appreciate my service, and it is, I've probably, I don't know, given more thought to it just in a general way in the past few years than I ever did before. But I think it's because of what's going on everywhere, and I just wonder sometimes why, or what we're going to get out of it. It's not like when we would go into a war, they won it. There wasn't any doubt about it, we won it. And today you never know whether you win it or lose it. And even after you win it, you've lost it, because you've still got all your troops there and pouring money into it and everything else. It's not like it was then. So it's just, I've had a lot of thoughts and talked to people like my friend Mike, and who was in service along, I think he was in 8 years. And I enjoy thinking back about it. Ruth says I never forget my cap, but I don't wear it in restaurants. That's another thing you learn. I had a little get-together the other day with some nurses and doctors. One lady doctor walked into the room and I stood up. That's nothing new to me. And she says, you know, I haven't had a gentleman stand up in front when I walked into a room in a long time. You're a real gentleman. I said, you have to learn things like that. Well, again, I think some of that rubs off in your military training. You learn things like that. I have our family physician right now is a lady, retired Air Force doctor. She walks in the examination room where we are. I stand, she said, as you were. We have a thing about it, but we both do that. You know, it's, yeah, I think back about it and what we did, even though, as you said, I did not have any combat missions. And so I guess I was fortunate in that respect, unfortunate in some respects about it. But still, it's the way it was. At least, as they say in the 303rd, you were there. If we needed you, you were there. So I have nothing against, I think it was, again, it was good for me. Made a better person out of me.
I want to thank you for your participation in the Veterans History Project. And I also want to acknowledge you for your service to our nation during World War II.
Thank you. It was a pleasure doing it. I've enjoyed just going back and thinking about it.
And thanks again for...
Had a lot of little funny things, and then, you know, but I do not recall any, what I would recall any real nasty, bad events in my time in service.
Well, thanks again, Mr. Adams.
Is that off now?